Welcome to Season 1 of Another Name for Everything with Richard Rohr, exploring the core themes of his new book, The Universal Christ.
As mentioned previously, this podcast is recorded on the grounds of the Center for Action and Contemplation and may contain the quirky sounds of our neighborhood and setting. We are your hosts. I'm Paul Swanson.
And I'm Bree Stoner.
We're staff members of the Center for Action and Contemplation and students of this contemplative path, trying our best to live the wisdom of this tradition amidst neighborhood dogs' incessant barking, sleepless nights, and the shifting state of our world.
This is the 10th of 12 weekly episodes. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 16, Transformation and Contemplation. In this conversation, we explore the role of contemplation in rewiring us to be able to perceive and live from the universal Christ.
One more thing before we get started. Bree and I are having a blast being in conversation with Richard, and we would love to hear what questions are arising for you as you listen to this podcast or read the book. So if you have a burning question related to the themes of the Universal Christ that just won't leave you alone, head over to cac.org/podcast and follow the instructions there to submit your question. After this season is over, we'll sift through the submissions, pour a glass of something tasty, ask Richard your questions, and then share his responses with all of you.
Richard, today we wanted to talk about Chapter 16, Transformation and Contemplation.
Okay.
We're going to get right into the good stuff now.
Good.
And you start this chapter talking about the fact that the idea of a cosmic or universal Christ is really challenging for us because we're operating with the wrong software, to put it one way.
Sure.
How would you describe our normal operating system and how contemplation can help update our software?
Let's come at it with this angle, that the normal way the self-enclosed person sees reality is me and not me. And you can understand how a child is going to start that way. But what life is meant to do is to, little by little, dissolve those boundaries. That's the whole meaning of love. If you don't do that, everything's me and not me. There's really no mind to understand this unitive Christ concept, which is a we concept, a participatory concept. So without major transformation, conversion, which is to overcome your separateness, I don't think the Western mind, the Eastern mind for that matter, is at all prepared to understand the Christ. Because what it is a moving from I to we, radical we, that the ontological truth is connection. The psychological construct is self, is separate self. So yeah, until those boundaries of self have begun to dissolve, we are not prepared to understand the notion of Christ. It's just a theological idea.
Yeah. And Richard, the word contemplation is going to come up a lot, I imagine, in this conversation. How do you define that word so that all those listening can have a kind of a base level understanding or starting point?
Well, let's try this time just the word itself in its Latin roots means to gaze at something. And sometimes we still use the word contemplate. I contemplated that. But a gazing until you see the dignity of a thing, the soul of a thing, in a certain sense, the equality of a thing, that it's part of the great chain of being just as much as I am. So again, we're talking about dissolving of boundaries, which can only happen gradually. And why it doesn't happen so often, let's say in your teens and 20s, and God certainly understands this, is you are trying so feverishly in your early years to create some skin, to create some self, what I call the first half of life. So unless there's been suffering or great love that has begun to dissolve those boundaries, most people in their teens and 20s just aren't naturally contemplative. They can't be. They're still asserting, and they have to, their identity, their selfhood, their dignity, their importance. I mean, I certainly did that. I went off to a seminary and put on a robe and became a priest and a Franciscan. That was all okay, but now I look back on it, it was grasping for a persona. And this was one that seemed good. We all do that, and God loves that. So, but your question was, how would I describe contemplation? When you stop seeing things in what I call the subject-object split, and you begin to read reality subject to subject, center to center, dignity to dignity, that's a different way of seeing. It's what we called yesterday the I thou instead of the I it.
My next question kind of pulls with that contemplation of how has contemplation helped you expand the notion and relationship with Jesus and the Christ?
Well, what I think I experienced in my early God experiences, which were not always precisely Jesus, and I certainly wouldn't have had the notion of Christ I have now as a young man. But what I felt was that subject to subject, center to center relationship being initiated from the other side. You know, someone is loving me. Someone is allowing me. Someone is choosing me. Now, the name I gave that someone was God. Now, I could also call it Jesus or Christ, but I don't need to. Do you understand? Yeah. It was again a dissolving of, or a lessening. Let's not call it a dissolving of boundaries, because you always have boundaries, or there isn't an I, thou. There still has to be an I here or a thou there. So, as I would allow that to be dissolved in me, that's what mercy and forgiveness and compassion does. When you experience God's mercy towards you, you realize He is not holding me to my self-defining mistakes or my self-defining stupidities. He is dissolving them. She is dissolving them. Of course, it's not a he at that point. Yeah, that's all that comes right now. Okay.
Beatrice Brutto talks about how the self is actually defined not by a sense of a noun of what it possesses or what it has, but rather by its relationships. And what I'm thinking about as you're saying this is that in a way the contemplative mind helps us see a web of relationality.
Yes.
Instead of focusing on just the part, which we get so stuck on normally.
Yeah. And God must understand this because, this is your audio receiver station. And so how I feel this morning naturally dominates the field. How can it not? What I'm thinking this morning is your beginning place. So what you're doing in contemplation is lessening that reference point, lessening that perspective by allowing the self to expand. Where you, again, I'm repeating myself, but where you see reality through a radical connectedness. It's not just relationship, but it's the quality of your relationship, the trustfulness of it, the warmth of it, the trust of it. So, I think a lot of people have had a relationship with God, but you find out when you do spiritual direction, the God they had relationship with was toxic, was a torturer, it was all fear-based. So you can't just say relationship. You have to say the quality of relationship. Now that, of course, brings me theologically back to the Trinity, that the quality of the relationship between the three is one of infinite self-emptying and infinite outpouring. If that's the template of reality, then all we can do is try to imitate that. Try. We never succeed, of course.
So would you say that a marker of a contemplative life is the outflow of that kind of Trinitarian creativity, generativity from love, not just for the sake of, creating, but rather for the sake of giving oneself.
That's good. The corrective that we often have to insert, and we're not trained to, as long as that self-giving is accompanied by self-emptying. So, not that you were saying that, but if it's all about my career, my creativity, that's all outpourings, you could assume that it's divine. But it's only divine if when you aren't getting anything out of it, money or fame or admiration, and you still will give for the sake of somebody else or some other cause. So you see why I get so excited about the notion of Trinity.
Yeah.
And this is appropriately said on St. Valentine's Day. Because our notion of love is all about being outpoured toward. And no accompanying notion of self-emptying. And I use the word self-emptying instead of sacrifice because the word sacrifice has been so polluted to just be another way to be egoic. I'm sacrificial. So that doesn't work. So it has to be self-emptying. Heroic sacrifice is very dangerous because it's usually still all about you. Not all, but mostly about you. That's why Jesus said, go learn the meaning of the words. What I want is mercy, not sacrifice. He quotes that several places. This rather obscure passage in Hosea. I think that's very significant because he was coming from a sacrificially based religion, as we do too, of course, same way.
This brings to mind, Richard, the first question I asked you in our first episode, where I asked you, how do you explain Christ to a child? And as you're talking about self-emptying and self-giving, what comes to me now is I realize that my intention with that question, although I didn't realize it until I read a passage later on in the book, was that how do I want to pass on this transformative nature of Christ. And then I read this. I want to just tell you, then I want to ask you a question after this.
Okay,
This is,
go ahead.
From this chapter. We can begin to understand that the Christ mystery is not something we need to prove or even can prove, but a broad field that we can recognize for ourselves when we see in a contemplative way, which often we see more symbolic and intuitive than merely rational.
Yeah.
And I think what took that breath away from me when I read that was that I want my kids to be Christians in this way, but I no longer need to have that be the label they wear. Is that ringing true for how we can pass this on by just kind of helping the next generation see the field, the Christ mystery field, but not always having to force it into the box of naming it in religious categories?
I hear you, and it's a question a parent wants to ask. Again, it has to be a both-and answer. Don't be so eager to make sure they're into the universal Christ that you don't give them a gateway. In one place in the book, I call Jesus like a shortcut on your computer screen. I'm not saying he is the only way, but he is a good, really good shortcut. If you have a proper understanding of Jesus, he's a very good shortcut. So know that a small child cannot easily think conceptually universally. It's the scandal of the particular. We start with the concrete, we move to the universal, normally. And it's the same way in pedagogy. A little child, most easily, I'm not saying only, but most easily, probably needs to look upon a Jesus figure or some other Hindu figure, I don't care, but something that communicates outpouring love for them, that pulls them into a world of safety and security and dignity. I think we got to keep saying dignity, because what we saw in the way so many of us were raised is this God didn't really give us dignity. She was always well, it was he then, was always taking it away. You're a sinner. You're inadequate. You're unworthy. That's no small point. When your God is not giving you dignity, well then it's no surprise we grew up taking away other people's dignity.
Right.
Because God did. A good preacher gave a fire and brimstone sermon, and that's what Christians even came to expect, to be reminded on Sunday morning of their sinfulness. Talk about a negative agenda, you see.
And their powerlessness. Like,
yeah.
There's a lack of agency,
Very
of
good.
participation.
Very good. Yes. So, am I answering your question?
You are. I think
Okay.
what I hear you saying is that we need to, one, ground the next generation in the image and likeness of God.
Yes.
Just that is a given, that the image is given, and that the likeness is the path. And that the gateway needs to be so personal to the cosmic that it can't be.
Where the heart and soul space isn't open.
Yeah.
You know, it's like what your first girlfriend or first boyfriend does for you. It opens up a space inside of you that you didn't know was there. Yeah. And that's why a loving God image does the same thing. Opens up a huge space inside of you that is so huge. Of course, you don't know this at first, but it has the power to include everything else. Yeah.
I think one of the things we struggle with, though, Paul, and I don't know if you feel this way, as parents, is that so much of how that particular personhood of Jesus is packaged is so negative, and it's unhealthy. There's an unhealthy relationship to culture, to context, that we've sort of interpreted Jesus in such a different way than even, he likely was in his own life. And so one of the things that I find myself doing or trying is, from my own life, stories and literature played a huge role in actually creating a better picture of anthropology than the scriptures did. A better image for what the human journey can look like. I think of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald, and now I'm deep in Harry Potter land right now with the kids. And it's so, there's beautiful symbolism in it.
Yes.
And so I think,
if you're ready to see it.
Right.
Yeah.
What I appreciate about what you're saying is that the personal has a place, and giving our kids an actual story of personal stories of lives lived in the service of something greater, like Jesus did, is part of creating that neuro pathway, I guess, to put it one way, toward the cosmic. But that we don't need to expect, or maybe we can't expect to be able to engender the cosmic in everything right now. That's helpful.
I wonder if the parents' actions, behavior, doesn't communicate the Christ part. You don't have to do it verbally, but when they see that you don't put down black people, that you don't make fun of gay people, that you don't eliminate other Christians, they're getting the meaning of Jesus in a universal sense. You don't have to give it to them doctrinally.
Right.
They're going to watch your behavior. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And, you know, I've been saying lately, because someone who's been training us here in management and organization, I don't know if the quote is exact, maybe you can correct it. When culture meets religion, culture wins every time. Is that that's close to the quote, isn't it? Yeah. I don't think we knew how true that was, you know? That again and again, it wasn't the gospel, is the way we had already framed reality. You know, when I talk in the book about Carl Jung being very disappointed in his father and his five pastor uncles. And he looked at all of them and saw sour, unhappy human beings. Very, very disciplinarian-like, policemen more than pastors. Culture had won. I am not anti-Swiss. I've taught in Switzerland many times, but you can definitely see it's a culture where law and order and discipline, and probably historically very strong punitive patterns of child rearing, were the order of the day. Now, if that's the frame, peace is achieved in our house by daddy whipping us. Peace is achieved in our house by mother yelling at us. Do you see how, if that's your emotional frame, you transfer all of that to church, and you even expect that? I'm not trying to be anti the Reformed tradition, but I remember when I was in Geneva going to the church where John Calvin used to, after in his older years, he would attend. And his chair was still there in the sanctuary next to whoever the preacher was. He wasn't the preacher anymore. But he would sit there with this whip. The whip had to be 10 feet tall.
I can't believe it.
And if anybody fell asleep in the church,
Oh my gosh.
it's still there. It's still... Oh my God. It's just... And I'm not putting Calvin down, but it's all moral behavior. It's not grace. It's not compassion. Because God, you know, I mean, the substitutionary punitive substitutionary atonement theory, okay, the word, I'm told, came from that tradition. They did many good things. Please don't hear me trying to be oppositional. But like the Catholic Church itself, they did many bad things too. And what history is forcing on us is to own that both-and character of almost everything.
Yeah, and Jung, I mean, since you invoked his name, I'm just thinking of how he kind of overcame even being able to see the path of descent or the resurrection journey as the map, right? As the Jung did, yeah.
Yes.
And so what I hear you saying too is if we can give children that map through Jesus, then they later on in life see that map actually applies to everything.
There you go. Yeah. That's very good.
I just want to close that loop as a
that's closing the loop.
Parents everywhere are dying. Just like, what do we do?
For some reason, this idea of a map makes sense to people as a replacement for the automaton savior who will take us to heaven.
Yeah.
That's what's fallen apart. It just doesn't make sense.
That's right. And it's helpful because that's how you frame Christ as this pattern of all reality. So then we can see it everywhere and we can experience it everywhere. But I'm realizing that as you're describing this kind of transactionalism in religion and in the Christian religion, how much a product of our binary minds that is, and how inadequate that kind of transactional mentality is to deal with mysteries such as love and suffering. And I want to read this line where you say, the binary mind, good for rational thinking, finds itself totally out of its league in dealing with things like love, death, suffering, infinity, God, sexuality, or mystery in general. And you often say that our gateways to transformation are great love and great suffering. And is that because those experiences short circuit that tendency to try to turn everything into a binary transaction?
I'm going to quote you on that. I love your use of the term short circuit, because that's exactly what they do. When you're in the middle of great love, great suffering, the binary mind isn't helpful, isn't useful, it's like regressing. But the trouble is, as you've heard me say, that wonderful temporary unitive consciousness that you don't even know you're enjoying temporarily. You're just enjoying it, but you don't stand back enough to know I'm thinking unitively right now. It usually cannot be maintained. In fact, I'm going to say it never can be maintained. You will always slip back the next morning into the first thing that irritates you, or your old resentments toward this person, or whatever it might be. No, that's very well said. So if I don't say it that way, and that's not the only reason I'm saying it, but we don't have a natural religion that was available to the Stone Age people, to the Mayans, to the Celts, to the Babylonians. But great love and great suffering were available to all human beings, maybe in a rudimentary way by a Stone Age person. I don't know what their level of consciousness was, but they're seeking to take care of their little babies, you know. They're sticking together with one another through tremendous hardship. That was their path to God. And suddenly, you know, it's one coherent universe. We're still, you know, millennia later, trying to learn how to do great love and great suffering. And I would say, it goes so far as to say, those are the only real messages religion has. How to do love and death or suffering. When we're not talking about those two, we're not talking. So again, I'm afraid I'm overusing the terms, but it removes us from automatic heavenly transactions that we're supposed to believe to a path where we really change at a cellular level, at a mental level. We process reality differently if we can maintain what we momentarily experienced in great love and great suffering. And that, as you know, is the only function of practices. If we don't say that, then, dang it, practices become another technique, an end in themselves. Do you understand?
Right.
I remember when I went to a Japanese Zen monastery, the moment I sat down, the abbot leaned forward, and what is your practice? And I'm not trying to put him down, but I talk about in the book how different that is from a Catholic monastery where the monk says, did they serve you lunch? So we all have our limits, I guess, but I just want to say that so we who teach contemplation don't make our preferred little method. And we Catholics did this with attending Mass every day. And it's made saints of many Catholics, but it's also become a catatonic repetition of words and formulas that precisely keep people at a lower level of love. It's just to keep reasserting how holy they are. It's still all about them, as we say. And that's the danger of any transaction. You used the wonderful word before, agency. I'm still the agent, and I'm choosing to go to Mass to prove to God my worthiness, which you already had before you went to Mass.
Sure.
You see?
But one of the things that I appreciate about what you're saying is that if we do, so we have these kind of peak experiences of great love or great suffering, and feel that kind of, like the veil parts, we feel the interconnectedness of love in all things, and yet you're saying that the goal of practice then is to habituate ourselves to that,
Perfect.
To help
Good word.
rewire us to that reality, without turning the practice into the new thing.
That's right.
That we're
That's what
overly
saying.
worshiping. But I think it's helpful, and I guess this is a question that I have is, discipline is important.
Yep.
There is a place
me there,
for that.
Take me there. Go
So
ahead.
what is the relationship between, what's the right relationship between practice and discipline? Because I find that a lot of us, especially in the millennial generation, we want the goods without the work.
Yeah. Resist the discipline.
Yeah, we want the
That's
consciousness
very true.
without the time and the
Yeah.
practice and the discipline and the years of commitment to get us there.
Yeah. I just gave this retreat for a whole bunch of Franciscans who are forming our new one national province. And there was a beautiful nature-based chapel on the grounds of the retreat house where you could look out through the big glass windows at the trees. And several times in the middle of the day when I'd go over there for several different reasons, I would see one or the other of the old friars just sitting in that chapel. And I knew they were beneficiaries of years of discipline, I just sat, just sitting there, I don't know, I didn't check out how long they stayed there. But I know there are friars who their opinion is without one full hour a day of prayer, you can't live the Christian life in any depth. Now, we've lessened it to 20 minutes in our sit, But isn't that beautiful that there were enough? And when I first joined the Franciscans, a novice in 1961, we had to be in the chapel, I guess it was 6 o'clock, and the first half hour we had to spend on our knees. The chapel was still largely dark in total silence. Now the trouble is, no one was teaching us what to do with our mind. Just kneel in the dark in silence. Well, the wonderful thing is, many good things happened. That it did for me during that very period. I don't think it did for everybody, though. For many, it became an obedience, not an inner experience, something they had to do. Did I answer your question? What did you say?
Yeah,
No.
just the relationship. No, you're getting there. The relationship, what's a healthy relationship to discipline?
Oh, to discipline,
'Cause
yeah.
we almost want to just throw that away, but I feel
yeah.
that the monastic traditions gave us such a
Us,
model.
yeah,
There is a
model
role for
of
it.
that. There is a place for it. So maybe it's just important that we say that, and that you say it as a millennial, to recognize it isn't the virtue of most younger people, to be honest. Like if it was enforced on me at 19 for a whole year, I wouldn't have ever had that, but I had to be there. I would have get whipped. No, I wouldn't. But I would have been disciplined. Richard, you weren't. Well, you know what my name was then?
What?
Alexander. Alexander, you weren't at prayer this morning, We used to be given new names. The day we'd receive the robe, you're kneeling there. It was middle of August, terribly hot. We had to wear these black suits. We come in and he says, henceforth you will be named. And you're just, oh God, I hope I don't get a crazy day.
This is like the sorting hat in Hogwarts for those that are as deep into Harry Potter land as I am, where the hat decides what house you go into.
Oh,
yeah.
God, that's a wonderful connection. But you'll be known as Friar Alexander. Oh my God. I guess that's okay. Do I like it? So I'm going up, and I take my clothes off, and they put my robe over me, and it's so exciting, terribly hot. But there was a discipline in that world that has served me well for the rest of my life, where you internalize the discipline. Now I wouldn't be tied to the formulas of doing it the first thing in the morning, or being on my knees, or being a full half hour. But yeah, and that's the real goal, for virtues to be internalized. So you don't need the external coercion or the social pressure, but you just internally recognize, no, I need to ask this of myself, or give myself in this way. So thanks for bringing it up.
It keeps us honest, it sounds like. It keeps us in an honest relationship where the inner matches the outer.
Ah, very good. Yeah, nice.
I think of older values like building character. Like how much do we really talk about that now? And yet I feel like character, discipline, the fruits of the Spirit, these are all things that kind of flow together. I thank you for answering that question. The relationship to discipline for me, I can tip into a perfectionism where I'm like, look how good I am. I did my double
and
20 minutes.
The ego will do that with it even
right.
when you don't want it to.
Sure. Yeah. But that kind of humility of honesty is a different, it feels like a helpful way to.
I'm becoming sort of soft and flabby. I need to pull myself a little together. Yeah. And that isn't said in a judgmental way to the self, just a growing way. I want to be all I can be for the sake of the world, for the sake of God. Yeah.
And part of what you're saying with that discipline is it freed you from the rigidity of it, but it also grounded you in something to return to. And I think about how you say in the book that I'm still in the theme of great love and great suffering, as those great teachers that we are able to go to the depths of spiritual things. And then practice you name as kind of this daily bread that we must kind of return to. And there's the discipline aspect of that. How has that daily bread helped sustain you during those seasons of great suffering? Just to put a little kind of flesh on this conversation, if anything comes to mind.
This is going to sound like such a stock answer. But even this morning, I just thank God for how lucky I am to have been given this one reference point, this one center. And I said, how do people live without you? I really, not in a patronizing way, but found myself feeling sorry for the millions of people who must be waking up this morning with no ultimate purpose for the day. Now, maybe I was overtaught ultimate purpose, but when I see the vacillating, whimsical personality we've created in Western civilization, where there really does seem to be no ground and no center and no goal. That's what philosophically we call nihilism. Nihil is the Latin word for nothing, nothingness. And I'm not trying to put such people down. I really say that with great sympathy. How do you wake up each day and create a meaning and a purpose and a goal for yourself by yourself? What else can you go toward except money and success and power? I would too. There's nothing else to get me through the day except getting a raise, having a sexual encounter are being important, So you can see why all the religious traditions call those passions that they don't upset God, they just keep you from God because they're false gods. And so if you worship them, you don't have the true center. You have a false center that will not really satisfy, will not really feed the soul or the body, for that matter.
You talk about in your book the fact that reality isn't what changes. In other words, that the core of what is really there has always really, really been there, but rather how we perceive what is real. And you use the word epistemology. What are some of the changes then? And I know we're circling around this, but what are some of the changes in our perception when we are looking through that Christ lens or that contemplative mind? What do we see?
The self, in a certain real sense, doesn't die, it disappears. And what I mean by disappears, it's still there, but it doesn't frame the moment, And so you can see things in themselves, as themselves, for themselves, and by themselves, in their inherent goodness, and you're free enough from weighing your own goodness to genuinely enjoy is the word I want to use, the inherent goodness of really almost anything. A twig. If you contemplate it, which means to look at it until you can appreciate it, you gaze at it until it becomes beautiful, you look at it until it shows its inherent worthiness, apart from that it's going to make me money, or allow me firewood for tonight, or all of those might be okay. But the contemplative mind moves beyond that. And so you see how this destroys all attempts to manipulate reality. It's been disappointing me over the years, I guess because I became fairly well known at one point, that there were a number of people who entered my life, and only years later did I grossly discover that I was being used for their own personal advancement. Oh, that was like a knife in the heart, But I don't hate them for it, but I just realized that was their whole approach to life. We call it opportunism. Everything is opportunistic. Even friendship, even relationship is, to get close to Richard Rohr is, they thought, it really isn't, but is going to get me somewhere. We almost all have to be purified of that manipulative, opportunistic level of motivation, which we all start with. But I'm just amazed how it maintains itself in our culture.
Yeah.
That we could have a president, who seems to know no worldview beyond winning. He turns everything back, everything, and I'm not exaggerating, to winning or losing. That's the hell of the self as an absolute reference point. There is no other meaning than winning or losing, and that isn't even an exaggeration. And he surrounded his entire office with similar people.
It's like a whole worldview of I, it, right? That's subject,
right.
Object.
Excellent. Everyone is objectified.
Yeah.
That's why they're all betraying one another and stabbing one another in the back. That's why you almost have to feel sorry for these rigid personalities. I see it in new reforms in Christianity. If it's a real rigid, dualistic founder, you wait one generation and they'll be eating one another alive. That it's no reform, it's no renewal. You start with a dualistic revolution or reform and just give it 5 years, and it's the same damn thing. I use the word intentionally, all over. I was in Nicaragua in 1985 in the middle of the Sandinista revolution, and I was in the front row with Peter, Paul, and Mary, and we were, I was singing for them. I wasn't joining them on stage, but obviously Richard. But even while we were there, we were beginning to see, and I had the Sandinistas in my on a huge pedestal of this is reform. And even as I got to meet several of the inner circle, junta, they call it, several of them were very disillusioning to me. They said, this is not going to be a long-term reform, One took me out to his beautiful art-covered mansion on the edge of Managua, and he's talking about the poor, and he is already living, top of the pile. I'm just, I guess, rambling, but if you don't have a real change of consciousness, you normally repeat in a different mask the same thing you came to reform.
Oh.
It's just, why don't we see that at this point in history? And as you know, that's why I can't give up on religion, because it still keeps pointing to radical reform, not just being a leftist, not just being a revolutionary, a socialist, or it doesn't work.
And you're naming the almost inability for the contemplative mind to be power grabbing, right? Because it doesn't see, it sees that there's a bigger picture beyond that.
Yeah.
And when you talked about in your book about the sordid past of Christianity and all the trauma it's created, but yet your ability to stay within the church and work towards reconciliation, integration, and forgiveness. How has the contemplative mind allowed you or created the space for you to accept the history of Christianity and still have a foot inside of it?
That's only worked for me in my fully adult years. What held me in my early years was that I was lucky enough, as I think you also were, to have an original, youthful, very positive experience of Catholicism. Really, there is such a thing. And I think you had it in evangelicalism. Why would I want to reject my beautiful Catholic boyhood, I love the title of Carol Houselander's book that I begin with, A Rocking Horse Catholic. She already in the 30s recognized that you got to go back and forth on this rocking horse, which gives away Carol Houselander had a non-dual mind, although she would have never used that term in the 1930s, I guess. So I have a positive early experience of Christianity to hold me, to hearken back to. I don't need to react against it, even though by today's criteria, I'm going to use a harsh word, so much of it was garbage. But that's only by today's criteria. Yeah. So much of it was, in effect, anti-Protestant, very white bourgeois, not upper-class bourgeois, but lower-class bourgeois, and nevertheless the same. So, but that's not fair. To judge the past, which worked for you as a little 10-year-old boy, by what I know now at 76. And so to accept myself and my worldview now does demand conscious, non-dual perception. Mm. But I didn't need non-dual perception. Now, that's not true anymore. You who were born into disorder, born into criticism, dismissal, chaos, and cynicism, I'm still not sure how it's going to play out with all of you. Because where do you learn non-dual consciousness when there's so much not to forgive, or that seems unworthy of forgiveness, or has to be named, has to be blamed? So I think it's going to be a harder path. Now, again, you had good families and a good beginning. But the amount of young people today who are growing up in chaos and total cynicism from both parents, wow. I don't know. I don't know, because what I usually find them doing is they are so desperate for order by the age of 30 that they manufacture order and revolve their whole world around one thing, like tattoos. I'm not against tattoos, but I'd meet people at the jail, that's all they could talk about. That was their frame of reference. If you do not discover true transcendence, you will become transcendental about something that isn't transcendent. We have a member on our staff who says his father is just obsessed with guns, collecting them, naming them. using them, comparing his guns to other people's guns. Is that the meaning of life? You will create a center point. You will, if you don't find a real center point. You have to do it for mental coherence, or you go crazy with your bobbing mind. So that's why I thank God for showing herself to me, that I was given a transcendent reference point that is worthy of the name, that is really transcendent, and not just guns or tattoos or the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Let's be honest, that's the dueling religion in America today. It's not Catholic Protestant, it's Republican Democrat. And people hold on to those political labels that are constantly in flux with the rigidity that we used to be Catholic or Protestant, which was equally stupid. But the dualistic mind will always refine itself to give itself false comfort on one side.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, darn it.
Such a small North Star.
Such a small North Star.
Yeah.
Very good, yeah.
I want to have you read a passage, if I can find it in this book.
Let me read it.
So it's this passage right here. If you
Okay.
just read that section.
All right, this is on page 206. Frankly, a new humility is emerging in Christianity as we begin to recognize our many major mistakes in the past, especially our tragic treatment of indigenous people in almost all the nations that Christians colonized. And that is not an exaggeration. There's no European country that can say we didn't do it. They all did it. Along with our silence about and full complicity with slavery. Talk about the ultimate I-it relationship.
Right.
You know there's no contemplation left when you have slaveholder religion. Destructive consumerism, apartheid, white privilege, the devastation of the planet itself, homophobia, classism, and of course the Holocaust. You know, as a German, I always take note of the Holocaust because this is my ethnic race. And if you've ever been to Germany, there's beautiful churches in every town. And there's Lutheran academies and Catholic seminaries in every other town. And yet twice in a 50-year period. I don't even need to say it. And they know this. How could Christianity be so wrong? I'm preaching now, I'm sorry.
No, it's good.
Back to the paragraph. Our dualistic logic allowed us to justify almost anything the corporate ego desired. If the corporate ego wanted Germany to rule the world, forget about Jesus. Right? Now we are a little less arrogant about our ability to understand, much less to actually live this one true religion of ours. That's the phrase we grew up with. Were you the one true religion? That was a Catholic phrase, I guess.
Basically, the Baptists were the one true
Oh, you were
religion.
the...
Yeah.
I thought my little Swedish covenant denomination was the one true religion.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
And the thing is, it was not one. It was partial in all three cases.
Right.
The way that word one was used by the early fathers meant unitive of the whole, Catholic, in that sense. Our critics are not about to let us forget our past mistakes. So we're stuck with them forever. And anybody can Google, anybody can read a history book. The harsh judgments of humanity against the actual performance of Christianity are with us for the rest of history. Oh, my heart just sinks. Because I don't want to have to be an apologist the rest of history. I want to get on to the positive visionary message, you know. But I know a lot of young Catholic priests who almost their most exciting course in seminary is apology, Catholic apologetics. It's from the first word. It's a defensive posture. And ending up being a very offensive posture. Why we Catholics alone are the one true church. All people need to do is Google, and they will know what really seems to have happened. So now we have no choice about integrating the shadow. We have no choice.
But to me, is it's so refreshing, that humility that you're describing there, to look at the whole and say, yeah, we've really, misinterpreted our own heritage of our own, our founding teacher, Jesus. We've really screwed this up in a lot of different ways. And your ability to name our kind of collective complicity in that.
That's a good word.
Is so refreshing. And I want to know, how does contemplation help create the space for us to both see our suffering, the collective suffering, our role in it, and still the hope at the same time of moving forward as you're naming?
What's taken away from you in the contemplative mind is the need to blame, the need to accuse. I'm sure you've been told the very word Satan means the accuser. When you don't need to scapegoat and to find out who the bad guys are and to pretend you have localized evil. That's the illusion. I have localized evil, and it's whatever. Like the Taliban are saying, it's soft Islam. Soft Islam is the problem. So in the name of our hard interpretation of Islam, we're going to destroy one after the other Islamic city. It's just, talk about being counterproductive to your own people. It just gets stupider and stupider. I don't think that's a word. But once you don't need to blame, once you don't need to scapegoat and localize evil elsewhere, I can't exaggerate what a freedom that is. It's an entirely different mind. When you don't even need to do it with the car in front of you that is going too slow or whatever it is. And I'm not saying I don't get upset at such things too. But there are people who really get upset at it, almost ram you because you're not going fast enough. There's the need for my inner anger to be expressed. But it never occurs to them that I, in my slow car, maybe I occasioned the anger, but I didn't cause it. You were an angry person before you pulled up right behind my car. And then I brought it out of you. That's what the nonviolent teachers like Gandhi and Martin Luther King really brought to human awareness. And why they would do provocative things in Alabama and Mississippi to reveal what was already in Alabama and Mississippi before they came. But non-seeing people blame them for it. You caused the violence. No, I provoked it. Oh, God. Why can't people see that? It's a seeing that seems to be a gift from God. To recognize the hidden nature of sin, the hidden nature of evil in the egoic self, and in egoic structures, maybe even more so.
Well, I think you're naming it. It's that we don't like to see it in ourselves. We don't want to see it in ourselves.
I don't.
And
I want to be a good boy. I'm a one.
Yeah, but I appreciate that that passage and in this book, the way you describe contemplation as what frees us to actually see our part, our complicity. We are part of this great system. We can't scapegoat anymore. We have to own it so that we can become free of it.
Yes.
And that participatory liberation is so exciting.
Well, it is. If we would have seen the life of Jesus and the cross in particular as God's giant act of absolute solidarity with the human situation, hold on to that word solidarity, then it's just as you said. It's not anything else than agreeing to be in solidarity with the evil of the world, with the suffering of the world, instead of seeking a pure pedestal of superiority. And that's what all Christianity seemed to think it needed to do. And you still see it in the arguments of politicians, each trying to find their moral high ground by different criteria, but both wanting to be pure and perfect, when you and I both know they're not. Mm-hmm. You're fighting a futile game, that you are not complicit in the evil of America, but it's only the Democrats who are. You just want to say, oh, stop it. That's really stupidity. Mm-hmm. Or the Republicans. It doesn't matter.
I'm going to jump here, Richard, to what you teach at the Living School for Action and Contemplation, our flagship program here, of what you teach students during their first kind of on-site intensive with you during their first year, which you call your methodology. Can you give a kind of an
methodology? Is that what you
your
said?
methodology,
Methodology,
of experienced scripture and tradition. Can you just give like a brief, why is it so important for folks to understand as they begin this work on this resurrection journey?
Yeah, this is what I start with the very first day. What is our methodology? By what authority does Richard say the things he says? Who do you think you are? A man of minimal intelligence in the United States of America, white privileged cleric, Unless I can know that what I'm saying is not my own, but I am communicating from a larger lineage that was punctuated again and again and again. Now that's what we call the perennial tradition. So the words that were fought about so much in Christian history were scripture or tradition, endlessly. And of course, good old Luther comes along, sola scriptura, only scripture. And we good Catholics fought him back and in effect said only tradition. What we have done in the past is the way it always will and always should be, and so forth, That became the usual law of two, endless argument that goes nowhere. And the evangelicals dug their heels more into sola scriptura, which created, frankly, modern fundamentalism. Because if you think you can only prove things by a line from the Bible, your bandwidth of available authority and source for truth is so narrow. It's just, my God, you're going to create anti-intellectual people. I don't know what else to say. Unthinking people. By the same token, if you Catholics keep thinking tradition is the way you did it in Portugal, or the way you did it in the Netherlands when you were growing up in the 1940s, that's not tradition. That's custom. And we confuse custom with tradition. That was our Catholic sin. So what neither group recognized, and this might be the important insight that the students almost just seem to nod whenever I say it, is that neither the Catholic school or the Protestant school recognized that they were using scripture and using tradition through their personal experience, but didn't have the honesty or the tools to recognize that, the filters to recognize. Okay, you're saying sola scriptura, but it's through the Spanish culture's interpretation of scripture, or whatever culture it might be. So that's why I call it the tricycle, our methodology. And I deliberately, intentionally, I hope correctly, make experience the front wheel of the tricycle. Because experience is going to be what you rely on anyway. And let's start admitting it. Let's start being honest about it, that we interpret scripture, we interpret tradition through our limited cultural, intellectual, psychological personality. What else can you do? And God is humble enough to deal with that. So I can almost feel the relief in the room when you say that to students. But see, I've got to emphasize, we weren't taught that. We Catholics were told not to trust our experience, even though we did anyway, but to trust the Pope's experience, or the bishop, or the priest. It was all top down. Protestants, starting strongly with Luther, when you say sola scriptura, that's a basis for dualistic thinking. You're being taught dualistic. Don't look at tradition. There is no perennial tradition. There's only the isolated believer with his little Bible. And so there's some truth that, not an entire truth, but that Protestantism was the birth of individualism, because I didn't need community. All I needed was me and my Bible and my sola scriptura text. So once we have the tools, as we do now, for allowing you to filter, to process your own experience by things like spiritual direction, therapy, psychology, spiral dynamics, the Enneagram, the Myers-Briggs personality profile. I mean, you all have 10 filters by which you can say, okay, maybe this isn't pure experience. This is my experience. Now we can put experience back on the front wheel. Then I find they can well carry, or experience filtered can well carry Scripture and tradition. And the three, in the long run, the three wheels, balance, check out, self-correct one another. And I think it gives you a very good basis for truth, spiritual truth. I'm not talking about medical truth. And that's a distinction we didn't often make. Spiritual truth, all right? That spiritual truth, if it's not just yours and your filter is critiqued, it is constantly in dialogue with the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and also honest enough about the whole tradition. So you've been in the class, well, both of you have, where I give you that diagram of the river, and a lot of people have never seen the whole river. All they saw was the little Calvinist reform in the 16th century, which was good, but it's too small. It's too small a pond. It's not the big ocean. So that doesn't throw out Calvinism or Lutheranism or Catholicism, for that matter. But what we Catholics didn't have the honesty to recognize is that we were only half, that we had excommunicated the Eastern Church. So all of us made the same mistake. We substituted our part for the whole. Now, in sympathy, they didn't have access to the whole the way we do today. So I can't hate them and think they were all stupid. They didn't have Google.
But it's interesting. 2 points. One is that we do tend to substitute the part for the whole. In other words, we project our experience or our lens onto the whole thing. The other thing that I appreciate about your methodology, Richard, is that a tricycle is in motion. It's
Very
in motion.
Good. Thanks for saying that.
So we're evolving. So the big T tradition, we're always gaining greater and greater perspective on what that big T tradition is.
Yes.
And so one of the things that you bring up in this book is the work of Barbara Holmes, who we love so much here at the Center. We're so grateful for. But how her work elucidates contemplation with a greater perspective, right, than we're typically used to in our kind of white ethnocentric focus. And she talks about contemplation as including moaning and singing and crisis contemplation. And so she's bringing us into a bigger picture, a bigger T tradition. How has she impacted you and your own views of contemplation?
I think the work of Barbara Holmes has been one of the greater breakthroughs in the evolution of teaching here at CAC. And it was you, Paul, who gave me the book. I think you put it on my desk. Thank you. Because I hadn't heard of Barbara. But as soon as I began to read it, I said, this is true. This is what I'm trying to say in my own feeble way by great love and great suffering. And now she brings it to an ethnic foundation that I suddenly could see that our definition of contemplation was too monastic, was too white, celibate, European, and too Buddhist. Not to put down any of those groups, but to have a black woman from the African experience. You know, when this has often hit me over the years, hit me again when I taught in Africa. I love to have Mass in these little African churches where the whole thing starts with everybody marching up the aisle in perfect symmetry. How do they do? We could not do it. And the whole Mass goes on. When one starts moving, they all move together. Do you see how we've got a collective we already? Shown in their body. And so dancing, moaning in the slave hold, ships coming across the Middle Passage where they couldn't even understand one another's language because they were from different tribes. Can you imagine the torture of that? Chained for weeks. I don't know if they force-fed them or if they fed them at all. We know many died. But what we're told in historical accounts is they began to moan together. God, collective suffering. This is the image of the cross in space and time. God was in solidarity with that. And they were in solidarity with God as soon as the I became a we. The I is too small to know God. So anything that moves you to a we is the beginnings of contemplation. And I think that's what Barbara Holmes is teaching, giving it the name of crisis contemplation, that often it takes a crisis to recognize your radical solidarity with your family, with your partner, with your children, with whatever it might be. So she's been a great gift to our, and the CAC, if I dare say it, is in a unique position to integrate this teaching. Because we're not monastic based. And as a Franciscan, I say, my God, this is why Francis said, don't speak to me of Benedict. He wasn't against the Benedictines, but he knew that was too ordered a model. It was too based on order, and Francis could deal with disorder. So he sent us into the streets of the city and the wilds of nature. And those were our monasteries, the streets of the city and the wilds of nature. So I don't mean to pull everything into my ambit, but I could see crisis contemplation is frankly much more of the Franciscan tradition. So I just bought it without any hesitation. Then when I met Barbara herself and was able to have a little, more than a little, private time sharing together, what I could easily discern was a woman who was radically God-centered. It was not intellectual belief. She knew God. As arrogant as that sounds, she knew God.
It's that elder energy. And the other marker that I think is interesting about how you frame contemplation here at the center and also in the book is that it's incarnate. In other words, it's embodied. You can really, you can not just see it, but you can feel it in the energy of a person for whom this is a lifelong pursuit.
Yeah.
Richard, one of the things you bring up in this chapter is that we're not speaking of death avoided, but death transformed, and the practice of dying before you die.
That's pivotal.
And this has been such a big part of my own contemplative journey, is just the gratitude that can arise for life when I ponder my own death, that this is not a dress rehearsal for anything. This is it, right? How has that practice of dying before you die, what does that look like for you, and what does that bring into your own sense of embodiment and participation in mystery?
any kind of dying is never invited in. First of all, it's forced on you. You know what I can think of as a little boy, just hating to get up on a winter morning and go to school. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. Oh, why do I have to do this? And I was a good little boy, but I still, once you're under the covers and it's cold. But I realize now that what was first imposed by law, you have to get up, you have to go to school. Okay, I didn't think about God very much, but law is probably the first imposition of death upon you. No, you must do this for your sisters and brothers, for your mommy and daddy. Okay, I'll do it to conform and to keep from punishment. But then, when does it morph into recognizing that this ability to let go of your own willfulness, to let go of your own need. I can remember, I went to the seminary already at 14. It's a bunch of strong-willed, macho 14-year-old boys. I wasn't macho, but a lot of them were. All being very willful and wanting to win and wanting to be the smartest boy in class. That then I just in inkling ways began to recognize the only way community is ever going to happen in this place is I have to decide real early not to always have my way, or not to always be right, or not to always be first. So it morphed a little farther into choicefulness, into consciousness. Then when I was pastor of the lay community in Cincinnati, the New Jerusalem, I spent half of most working days just doing counseling, marriage counseling, counseling about all the problems young people have. And it struck me that almost all the problems were the self wanting to force itself on the situation, on the marriage, on another person. So what I learned, I hope those are good examples, that in each case it was a letting go of the way I saw it, the way I preferred it, the way I wanted it, to allow the perspective of another person. But every time, and still to this day, that feels like dying. It feels unfair. Dang it, why do I have to give up? It feels almost wrong. Well, I'm a person. I have rights too. And if you give in to those voices too quickly, you'll never surrender your ego boundaries. Yes, there is a self that has a right to protect itself, but don't start with that all the time, because she's a self too. And even little children are a self. And that's the beautiful thing about parents like you. I think for the first time in history, we have parents who've been able to recognize that child has a selfhood that I don't have the right to manipulate. You understand? Mm. That I don't have the right to force. Mm. What a evolution of consciousness that is, that you don't own your children. Yes, I do. I created them. Well, not really. You just waited for 9 months and God created them and gave them to you. I know that's a religious way of talking, but just know that all letting go will always feel like dying. Now, once you see that the practice, in fact, widens your field, widens the capacity for communion and community, it's much easier for me to trust at my age now. To bring it home, as you know, I'm called the founder of this place, but I really have very little to say about it. And that's fine. That's as it should be. And there are things that are happening. I just have to look the other way. I just have to bite my tongue. What? It's so different than my worldview would have once said. But I've learned, and I mean this sincerely, that by getting out of the way and biting your tongue and not assuming your perspective is the best, I've learned so much by not insisting on my way. So those are just silly, but I think real examples of dying before you die. Yeah. But you do have to do it enough to see that it's actually to your advantage and to the advantage of the group. That it's a bigger self each time. Now that's what makes it easy for me to trust resurrection. That if I can do that on my final day of life, there's going to be a bigger self emerging. I now can believe that experientially. Okay.
Thank you. Could you just, in closing, read...
the end of the book, huh? The sort of end of the book.
You have a couple great endings in there.
Yes. I am saying that the way things work and Christ are one and the same thing. This is not a religion to be either fervently joined or angrily rejected. It's a train ride already in motion. The tracks are visible everywhere. Oh, thank you for letting me write that, God. I mean, I agree with it even more as I read it. You can be a willing and happy traveler or not. It's just a choice, yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
For opening to that. Yeah.
As we close, the final question I wanted to ask is, where have you seen Christ in the way things work this week?
This week, where have I seen Christ in the way things work? First things that come to mind are stupid. What? You know, about 2 years ago, I began to accept that doctors were apparently going to be a regular part of my life. I used to just hate my yearly physical. Oh, God, got to do my yearly physical again. Now it's every other week, another doctor. Once I can accept the luxury that I even have to go to a doctor, that how many people in Asia and Africa and Latin America have all the diseases I have, but don't have a doctor. I was able to, now I don't fight going to the doctor, or resent it, or even resist it. Now, what I'm trying to describe is an inner experience of death and resurrection. What I once resented is now become okay. It's the way things work. This is the way your life has unfolded. Now, almost every other week, you have to go to a doctor for something. And I'm getting to know them personally, and they're getting to know me and the nurses, and it's all becoming sort of personal, another community that's really rather sweet. In fact, when I went 2 days ago to the dermatologist to take these spots off my head, the nurse who's leading me in, she says, "We just love your voicemail." I said, "How do you know who I am?" She says, "Oh, we all joke about your voicemail." I mean, I guess I say something real happy. "This is Richard Rohr." I don't know. She says, "No one else sounds as happy in their voicemail as you do." It's just neat to see how you can create community wherever you go if you move beyond this formality to those little personal things, you know? So doctors in the world of hospitals and doctors' offices are a new resurrection in my life. So who am I to complain? It's just luxury upon luxury, gift upon gift, grace upon grace, even all my health problems. So did that respond to your question?
It did.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks. You're welcome. Thank you.
The beautiful music you're listening to is provided by Bird Talker. Another Name for Everything with Richard Rohr is produced by the Center for Action and Contemplation, thanks to the generosity of our donors.
If you're enjoying this podcast, consider rating it or sharing it with a friend to help create a bigger and more inclusive community. To learn more about Father Richard and to receive his free daily meditations in your electronic mailbox, visit cac.org. If you want to learn about these ideas in more depth, check out the Universal Christ Resource Collection at universalchrist.org. From the high desert of New Mexico, we wish you peace and every good.